The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
The original Operation Choke Point was an Obama-era program carried out by the OCC and FDIC before your tenure to apply pressure and choke out disagreeable businesses like firearms dealers and payday lenders from the banking system. So Operation Choke Point 2.0 is an alleged crackdown on crypto-friendly banks. You said at the Milken conference this is the biggest story for the next 6 months. So are you thinking it's no coincidence?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's a question of whether any of this is connected to Silicon Valley Bank, but I think it's pretty clear there has been a decision across the bank regulatory agencies in this administration that crypto is inherently risky and needs to be extricated from the banking system. My personal view is, if you treated crypto as a normal yet high-risk legal activity, you would have crypto distributed across a large number of banks. No one bank would be the central failure node for the economy, and this would all be managed, much like other risky things are managed, like derivatives, like high volatility assets and other kinds of things. But because this was seen as a niche business and a super anathema business, it was concentrated in 2 or 3 banks, and those 2 or 3 banks have now largely been taken out.
If you could back up a bit, though, I mean, it does sound, at least just from some of the public comments that people have been making here, and I guess you'd be one of them, is that this was sort of I don't want to say a coordinated effort, but was it a coordinated effort to do this? I mean, to knock it out? It doesn't, the government I know, the U.S. government I know isn't competent at anything, let alone something like that. And you've run the OCC. Do you think that they actually have the mental capacity to do that?
Well, 100%. I hate to burst your bubble, but yes, the way the bank regulators work is that they are highly coordinated. I mean, when I was running the OCC, I had a weekly call with the FDIC chairman and with the vice chairman of the Fed for bank supervision. We talked every week for an hour and talked about what our priorities were for the coming week, how we could support each other, how our actions would affect the system. So these things are not accidents at all. I'm highly confident of that. And honestly, if you look at the SVB situation or the post-SVB situation, it's interesting because it is a coordination between the Fed and the FDIC. The Fed has created this new liquidity facility, which is broadly available to a number of banks, and then the FDIC is running this process to save the SVB depositors as an example of how these agencies work together.
But nonetheless, I mean, didn't these banks sort of invite this problem, if that is the case, because they just didn't do risk management properly. They had these long dated, they had these high duration parts of their assets, and that, of course, it's great when interest rates are about flat or declining, but it's not so great when it's rising. So, I mean, wasn't it just these kids who had no experience in a rising interest rate environment, sort of opening the door for chaos?
Well, I guess what I would say is we have to separate the crypto situation from the SVB situation. I mean, SVB was not particularly exposed to crypto as like a fiat on and off ramp. I mean, yes, they supported some startups that happened to touch crypto, but I see Silvergate and Signature as totally different from Silicon Valley Bank. So you're right, of course, there was a failure of risk management at Silicon Valley Bank. They, for example, had an ESG committee, but they didn't have a chief risk officer for 9 months. But the other thing you have to remember is the reason that we have bank supervision is to be an early warning sign of those kinds of failures. So who supervised SVB? Well, the answer is the Federal Reserve. And who was raising interest rates? Again, the answer is the Federal Reserve. So you would think that... I'm sorry?
In all fairness, the regulatory side of the Fed isn't exactly sitting at the FOMC and making those decisions to buy and sell bonds. I mean, it's some poor schlub who has to sit there and go through a bunch of balance sheets all day. It's sort of like a different arm of the same institute.
I mean, Lawrence, I guess I would disagree with you a little bit there. I mean, one of the Dodd-Frank reforms was to create a Fed governor whose title was head of supervision across the system, right? So that person person sits on the FOMC and is in charge of bank regulation nationally. That chain of command absolutely is aware of interest rate risk and the interest rate risk created on a balance sheet that has long-dated, low interest rate assets. So there's no question SVB should have picked this up. I mean, they should have had a chief risk officer the entire time. But the backstop for failures like that is supposed to be bank supervision. If it isn't, then you have to ask yourself, why do we bother having bank supervision? What are they supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be picking up where the bank left off.
But again, I guess my question, well, that's SVB, but Signature Bank and also Silvergate was one where we had heard for a while, short sellers had been discussing this for a while, that they had a problem with risk management, that was actually the real underlying issue. It wasn't so much as their ties to crypto, but the fact that they did have this high duration on their portfolio. That's something that has been discussed for a while. I mean, that's not something that was a surprise. So in many ways, the Silvergate issue is the same as Silicon Valley Bank, a lot of S banks here, because I guess they're all in the S word now. But this is, it just seems to be a recurring theme that these were all banks that had poor risk management. And maybe the issue really is, if you're going to blame the Fed, is that a lot of people are asleep at the wheel now.
Yeah, well, so there's a lot in what you said to unpack. I mean, the first thing I would say is Silvergate Bank didn't actually go through a failure in a receivership, right? I mean, Silvergate is deciding to voluntarily return assets to its customers and its shareholders, which does indicate they didn't actually fail. I mean, my personal view of Silvergate, and I haven't studied its balance sheet as closely as I've studied SVB. I've looked at that super carefully. But at Silvergate, the issue you have there more than anything is concentration risk. I mean, they were heavily exposed to a single sector, which really made Silvergate look more like the subprime mortgage crisis, right? You had some banks that were so heavily invested in a single pro-cyclical asset that when the cycle turned, there was no alternative source of income on the asset side of their balance sheet. Whereas at Silvergate, it's really more, I would argue, the kind of risk management thing that you're talking about, which is asset liability mismatch. Silvergate wound up voluntarily. SVB failed spectacularly in a matter of days. Those are a little bit different.
What about with so there is this narrative that there was political pressure, and that was why Federal Home Loan Bank's line was withdrawn from Silvergate, perhaps why a sale was blocked for SVB, and why Signature Bank was shut down for crypto-related reasons, according to Barney Frank, who was a board member of Signature Bank. Do you agree with this line of thinking?
Well, I mean, again, there's a lot going on to unpack here. I mean, Signature. Let's just go through these individually, right? So the Federal Home Loan Bank issue is something that I think a lot of your viewers probably, is a new issue for them. Most of us don't think of Silvergate or Silicon Valley Bank as major mortgage lenders. Silicon Valley Bank had a portfolio of mortgages that it made to its wealthy founders. That was sort of a service business, but not the core business. And yet, because both of those banks had bought stock of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, they had a right to lines of liquidity, which the FHLB pulled. That's unusual and makes one wonder if there was a decision in Washington to do something about that. And my guess, having been in the housing sector earlier in my career, is yes, somebody at the top of the Federal Housing Finance Agency said, wait a minute, we're not spending our capital on these tech banks. We're supposed to be in the fair housing business. Signature, totally different story. I mean, I can't find anyone in my relationship network that's ever heard of a bank being closed down in the middle of the weekend. Obviously, nothing happened on Saturday that made Signature insolvent on a Sunday. And if Barney Frank is to be believed, Signature wasn't even insolvent. So that I just can't speak to. The very idea that it needed a line of liquidity is something nobody believed on the close of business Friday. That looks much more like an anti-crypto move based on everything that's publicly available.
Why do you think there is this political pressure? Where is it coming from? And what's the agenda there?
I mean, if you think about the way that bank policy gets made, it generally starts either in the White House or at the Senate Banking Committee, okay? And so the senior most Democrats on the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Brown of Ohio and Senator Warren of Massachusetts, have been very, very publicly anti-crypto for a bunch of reasons that I've talked about extensively elsewhere. One of them is crypto is user-controlled finance, and this is a crowd that believes in government-controlled finance. They've talked extensively about Fed accounts, about postal banking, and a whole series of other things that would imply a much greater degree of government control that crypto is consistent with. Now, they mask that under sort of the guise of consumer protection. We're very worried about all of these unsophisticated rubes who are buying Bitcoin. But in a world where 50 million Americans own Bitcoin, I don't think that argument washes anymore. It's too widely held of an asset, and it's too important of an asset in people's portfolios. So the only answer I can come up with is they have a view of government-controlled finance, and others have a view of user-controlled finance. One of those sides has to win, and they're not compatible with each other.
Brian, just want to turn to another topic for a moment, which is Binance US, which you headed briefly, and not going to go back to the past, but I'm just asking you your opinion sort of in your individual capacity. What do you think is the future of Binance US? Binance is clearly on the radar of US regulators. Binance US would be their way in. Do you think Binance US is going to make it? Do you think they're going to be able to acquire Voyager? I'm just curious, what do you see as the prospects for Binance US?
Well, good try. I never talk about Binance US. What I would say in this current environment, given their market share and Binance's market share generally, is I hope that they find a good way forward because the market kind of depends on them for liquidity. But I don't have any special knowledge of those things, and I wouldn't comment if I did.
And nonetheless, do you think that the SEC's opposition to Binance US acquiring Voyager, do you think it'll be successful in the end? And second of all, do you think any of it is warranted?
Yeah, I have no idea, what will happen there. I mean, we know that the bankruptcy court went ahead and approved the plan, notwithstanding the SEC objection, and that was a detailed and well-reasoned kind of bankruptcy court opinion on that. I can't say what will happen on appeal; it's anybody's guess. But listen, I think we all know that the SEC under Chairman Gensler has taken a generically hostile crypto stance, and I think if it was a different crypto acquirer, they would probably lodge the same objection. I don't think that's specific to this particular bidder.
All right. Do you think anything will further happen with the bank situation, with the crypto-friendly bank situation in the United States? Do you think everyone eventually will just leave the U.S.? Or what of the situation of on and off ramps in the United States for banks and crypto institutions?
Yeah, I mean, look, my guess is that when you have demand that is as strong as it is, there will always be smaller banks that are willing to step up and try to risk manage this. So, you get rid of Signature Bank and you have Customers Bank, and you get rid of Customers Bank and then you have Coastal Com. I mean, there's always somebody who's going to serve this because there's a demand, and crypto's not unlawful. The question then becomes, how quickly and how committedly is the administration going to go after every single last one of those, and how will they answer to the 50 million customers who are looking for fiat on and off ramps? My belief is that they're trying to send a signal that will eventually choke this off. That's again what Operation Choke Point was. But you can't kill all of the animals in the zoo at some point. So my belief is there will always be somebody serving it. It would be better if larger banks with better risk management were serving the sector. But if they don't, there will be somebody doing that. And hopefully over time, as the asset class matures, people will get comfortable with that.
All right. Brian, thank you so much for your insights.